sent to me by the Friday of next week, May 6th, which would then give us the 17 remaining days to negotiate our differences. So far, the legislature has resisted the requirement that they prepare an honest, balanced budget. And last April 12th, 2 weeks ago, our commissioners of Revenue and Management and Budget sent the leaders a letter which details the approximately $1.2 billion that each of the House and Senate budgets are short based on valid assumptions and valid financial accounting. And at that time, Speaker Zellers suggested that we get their private consultants and our state officials together in a room to resolve the differences. Well, we're still waiting for their private consultants to appear, and we have a meeting scheduled tomorrow, which we understand will be with their staff and our officials. So, you know, we've spent 2 weeks now unnecessarily just, discussing how we're going to provide a reckoning that's going to allow us to move forward and come to a common conclusion on by May 23rd. So again, I urge the legislature to fulfill its responsibility. I submitted a budget 70 days ago, February 15th, that was balanced based on the assumptions that Management and Budget and the Department of Revenue provided me. So I'm asking them to do now, 70 days later, nothing more than what I was required to do back on February 15th. Prepare an honest, balanced budget that shows the people of Minnesota what exactly they propose to do if they're going to keep this budget to the $34 billion that they claim is simply easily accomplished. So it seems to me to be an entirely reasonable position, and I would hope that they will concur so that we can get this matter resolved and meet the constitutional date for adjournment of May 23rd. Glad to respond to questions.
Do you have any leverage to get them to move on the request?
No, the only leverage is that they adjourn on May 23rd. And again, I'm mystified as to why they can't do what previous legislatures have done, what previous legislators did with Governor Plenty, sent him conference reports, and he didn't approve of them. But that provided the basis for their negotiations. So I just don't understand what's so difficult. And I told them over a month ago now that this was my expectation, entirely reasonable as far as I can see, that they should have to do what I did, which is have a budget that adds up to the $34 billion they've set. They don't want to raise revenues, so be it. But then tell the people of Minnesota exactly where they're going to make all the cuts necessary to achieve that target.
They've said they'd be willing to share their private consultants' information with you, but your RFP has stopped that process.
2 weeks ago, I offered to withdraw the RFP if that was the problem. I mean, I've heard one excuse after another. They were urging us to submit the RFP. Senator Koch, two occasions, asked where the RFP was. They'd known for weeks that the RFP was going to be issued. And I don't find that a credible excuse. But if that's the obstacle now, 2 weeks after this has come up again, then fine, we'll withdraw the RFP. I mean, this is getting to be the theater of the absurd, that we can't get responsible people to fulfill a requirement to prepare a budget that's based on valid, verifiable assumptions about the next 2 years that are going to begin in 2 months. And, hiding behind private consultants who won't come forward under one pretext or another is not responsible governance.
You said you want them by next Friday to pass the conference committee reports and send them to you. That would require you to act. I'll be well prepared to act. I'll be glad to be in here on Saturday the 7th, and I'll act, and then we can proceed from there.
Would you veto every one of them?
We'll see what they look like. I mean, at this point, they haven't come out, and I'm not going to decide until I see what they contain.
How does that help the process?
Because then they've established a budget. Because then I have a budget, and they have a budget, and we have our differences, and then we can begin to resolve them. But it's incumbent on the legislature. As I said this morning, I didn't create the bicameral system of governance, but that's what we have in Minnesota, and that requires a legislative position to be established by the two branches of the legislature through a shared agreement, which is the conference report. And then there's one legislative position, and there's one executive branch position, and then we can negotiate. Again, assuming we have both based our budgets on valid, verifiable assumptions, we can negotiate out our differences, find the common ground necessary to conclude by May 23rd, which is what the people of Minnesota elected us to do and expect us to do.
Governor, there are a lot of Republican caucus members in both chambers who privately say that they think if they play poker with you through May 23rd and they don't blink, you will. How would you address that perception on the part of some fairly important Republicans?
Well, I'm the third person in the history of Minnesota and the first Democrat to have been elected to both the United States Senate and governor, and I didn't get here by blinking.
Governor, they said yesterday that they wanted to keep talking with you, they want to have conference committees open and discussing with staff and your commissioners, and they think that having this kind of on multiple tracks, they can come to some kind of agreement with you. Is that possible?
What I've said to them before, and I've said this consistently for over a month now, is I'm not going to wade into their swamp and choose between their alligators and their crocodiles. They created these bills, most of them without any real regard for the positions that we set forth, for example, education policy. And now, and they, you know, somewhere along the line add up to cuts that I don't find acceptable in areas, and so now they want me to come in and save them from themselves. I mean, pick and choose between, you know, their most, you know, which one's the least worse of their options. That's their responsibility. They're the ones who said $34 billion is enough money to take care of all the state's needs. I didn't say that, they said that. So it's their responsibility now to show people what does that mean in real world terms, assumptions, and in real dollars and cents. And then the people of Minnesota can, along with me and others in the legislature, evaluate, you know, which is a preferable alternative. I mean, they love to attack my budget, and I've said before I wouldn't support my own budget either if I didn't have to. I mean, a $5 billion deficit is very difficult to contend with, but I did it. You can disagree with my choices, but they were valid assumptions, and nobody from February 15th until recently ever said that it didn't add up or balance. It does, did, still does. So, you know, all I'm asking them to do is the same thing that I did, which is present an honest, balanced budget, and then we'll start negotiating.
You're expressing frustration, considerable frustration here this afternoon. You met with Republican leaders this morning. Your tone the same this morning, or
I think it was about the same. I mean, it was very congenial a good part of the time, and you know, we get along very well on a personal level, and you know, they're very good people, and I understand their situation. I understand why they're resisting with every, you know, way possible having to do what I'm asking them to do, because as I've said before, if you're not going to raise $1 of revenue, you have to make very draconian cuts that have severe consequences for the lives of real Minnesotans. But that's what they've said rhetorically they can do. And I understand that they're resisting every possible way having to do what I would require them to do, which is to own up to the reality of what a live within their means, as they call it, a budget of $34 billion entails. But I told them that, you know, I just think that's their responsibility.
Governor, if you're not going to blink on tax increases and Republicans say they're not going to blink on holding the line on tax increases, where does that leave us? Or you?
Well, I mean, I don't, this is not, to do this responsibly, it's not about who blinks. It's about how do we find common ground. And I've said from the beginning that my budget is a first proposal, and I'm willing to move from it, to be flexible and to compromise. And I would need them to do the same so that we can find common ground, middle ground, that'll be necessary. As I've said before, compromise means that you agree to things that you don't agree with. I don't expect to convert them to my point of view, and they're not going to convert me to theirs. So we're both going to have to give up some of what we believe in in order to find that common ground, that midpoint, and I'm prepared to do that once they're ready to begin.
Would you ever give up on the upper income tax?
Again, I'm not going to start negotiating with myself. I'll start negotiating when they have completed their responsibility to present a honest, balanced budget the same as I did, and then we can start to look at the alternatives. But until I see what their alternatives are, I can't be expected to start negotiating.
Having stressed the importance of compromise throughout this process, you clearly are willing to come off with your desired revenue threshold. Can you give us some ballpark sense of how far you might move before you reach a point where you think you're passing the 50-yard line?
Well, I mean, do the math, but I think we've agreed, you got a $5.03 billion deficit, and I think that assumes a $175 million cash reserve. Commissioner Scholl would like to see that a bit higher. We agree on that, what that is. Then we're talking about a ballpark of a $5.1 billion gap, and we've, I think, agreed implicitly that we would not repay the school shifts, so that's $1.4 billion. So then you're down to $3.7 billion, and you split the difference on that. You got $1.85 billion of revenues and $1.85 billion of cuts. But that's not my position. But I mean, that's the math. That's the middle. That's approximately the middle ground.
And could Racino be part of that 1.4?
I'm sorry.
Could Racino be part of the 1.4?
I said I won't. I'm not going to close the door on that. I mean, let's see what the legislature does with it. But I'm willing to look at any valid source of revenue. My condition on a Racino, I'm not interested in expanding gaming to benefit to private operators. They'll certainly derive some benefit from it. They wouldn't be doing it. But I want most of the vast majority of the proceeds from any expansion of gaming to go to job creation and to education.
What about today's proposal? This would be gaming in bars and restaurants. The Senate author, Senator Fishbach, said she didn't see it as an expansion, but bringing things like video lottery into bars and restaurants. Would you be open to that?
That's a huge expansion, and I think alcohol and gambling really are a bad combination.
Have you suggested that the budget bills that come to you ought to have bipartisan votes on the floors of the House and Senate?
No, I haven't, because I don't think that's realistic. What I've said in terms of bipartisanship would be that any election reform, so-called legislation, would need to have broad bipartisan support, which is the same position that Governor Plenty and Governor Carlson, the last two Republican governors, have taken with the legislature. But the conference reports can come however they come, and I think they pretty much now contain every position that the Republican leadership and their members want to take relative to what they've said in the past, and that's their prerogative. I don't question that. I just want them to do it.
Is there such a thing as a gaming bill that would be a guaranteed fiscal help for 12-13? Because there's the specter of legal controversy over almost any gaming proposal that has come down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I think that's a fair assumption, but I don't know what the likelihood of a timetable for a legal process would be. But yes, I mean, that would have to be factored into part of the consideration in terms of what kind of revenues it would generate for the next biennium.
Have you talked to tribal leaders about gambling expansion?
Not recently, no. Not since. Well, I had the tribal meeting with all of the tribal leaders about second or third week or so of my term, and they raised it there. I haven't had a conversation since.
So even though they're meeting out here in a few minutes, they didn't ask for a meeting with you? Or?
No, not to my knowledge, no.
Are you prepared to call a special session if this doesn't go anywhere in the next?
Well, I wanted to get resolved by May 23rd. That's as far as I'm considering matters now. But I mean, the Constitution requires we agree on a balanced budget. So someday, and it should be by May 23rd, we're going to have to do that.
Would you consider that a failure of the process, or is that a special session? Is that the failure of individuals?
Well, I'm willing to compromise, but it takes two to tango. So I'm willing to do my part. I'm here. I've submitted a budget February 15th, 70 days ago, and as soon as they submit their budget to the people of Minnesota and to myself, then we can start this process. And if they will do that on a timely basis, then I've set forth a timetable now that would accomplish that. It gives them 2 weeks to pass the conference reports. I'm told most of the conference committees aren't even scheduled to meet this week, so I mean, it's really incumbent on them to fulfill their responsibility. As Commissioner Scholder said, this is sort of a three-part play, and the first part is, the first act is, I submit a budget. The second is they finalize a budget, one budget that they've agreed upon through conference reports that is honest and balanced, and then we start Act 3, which is to negotiate our differences, and 17 days is not a lot of time, but it's certainly achievable. But it's incumbent on them to pass these conference reports and stake out what their position and tell the people of Minnesota what is their budget going to look like. They want me to accede to it. What am I acceding to?
Given all that is left to be done here in the next 25, 26 days, whatever it is, has time run out on the Minnesota Vikings to get a stadium? Is that, you've got so many other things to do, how could that possibly fit into this equation?
Well, the first legislative session I was involved in was 1977, and the time never runs out till they take the hood off the clock somewhere after midnight on May 24th.
But it certainly doesn't, I mean, a bill's been introduced, no one seems to like it, and there's all this budget work that needs to be done. Are the Vikings in danger of running out of time once again?
Well, I mean, again, it's going to take a legislative initiative, but I've said this in a complimentary way, unlike the U.S. Senate, which is linear and taking one bill at a time and then talking about it for a long time. The legislature is very capable of multitasking. And so a lot can move forward simultaneously, and some of it, goes through committees, and some of it's more behind the scenes, and then suddenly either goes through a committee or doesn't go through a committee and ends up on the floor, and ultimately it's going to take the legislature majority in the House, the majority in the Senate to pass the stadium bill and me to sign it. But that's still plenty of time theoretically for that to occur.
Speaking of multitasking, at your breakfast this morning, photo ID came up. The lawmakers seemed hopeful that you would sign a photo ID bill. Can you be a little clearer on where you are on that?
Well, I have said before, I think it's a solution in search of a problem. And we've had 2 recounts now, the last 2 years, and they've proven that Minnesota's got one of the very finest, most reliable, most accurate voting systems of any state in the nation. What I understand to be the premise behind and that's what I was asking this morning, but why this is considered to be necessary was that we would prevent felons from voting, and felons should not, no one should vote illegally in this state, and no one should be allowed to do so, but it's not clear how requiring, I mean, felons can have driver's licenses, so having a photo ID doesn't state one way or the other whether somebody is legally eligible to vote. The county attorneys have suggested a system whereby the Secretary of State and the counties would previously verify who's eligible and who's not, and that would be established on the voting sheets that the election judges have before them. And I mean, if there's some concern that there are people voting illegally in Minnesota, then let's tackle that problem. I mean, I think there were 7 demonstrated cases out of the last election, so it's very minor. But as I told them this morning, my political career was hanging by a thread which depended upon an accurate reckoning of the votes that were illegally cast in the last election. So I totally appreciate and totally support the desire that only people in Minnesota who are legally eligible to vote should do so, and that every vote legally cast should be accurately counted. Totally in agreement with that. The question is, what's the problem that needs to be corrected, and what is the way to do that? And I don't see how photo ID addresses that issue at all. But again, those discussions are still going on. And the other point I'd say is, again, going back to what Governor Carlson and Governor Plenty said in the past, I agree, and we have letters from both of them that they sent previously, that any election reform legislation needs to be passed with broad bipartisan support.
And Governor, if the Republicans chose to put that issue on the ballot as your constitutional amendment, would that be an appropriate thing to do?
No, it's totally within their prerogative, sure.
And your attitude would be,
Well, I can have an attitude, but this doesn't affect the process. They don't need my signature on that, and that's the way the Minnesota Constitution is written. So I'd have to see what it says to know whether I'd be for or against it. I'm not taking a position on something that hasn't even, to my knowledge, maybe it's been drafted, but I haven't seen it.
Will you use your bullet pulpit to campaign for or against something like that?
Again, I'd have to see the language. I'd have to know what it is. But I'm total confidence in the ability of the people of Minnesota to make wise judgments, and so if they want to put that on the ballot, again, that's their prerogative.
Governor, when the light rail system is finally built between Minneapolis and St. Paul, would you expect the ridership, say, out on the North Star Commuter Rail in that area, would you expect that to go up? Or is that a separate line and unaffected by?
No, well, it certainly could go up. The main thing that line needs is needs a route that goes to the main population center, the services, which is St. Cloud. To stop the line in Big Lake, I mean, is really very short-sighted and produced exactly the expected result, that it suppresses ridership. Dick Braun, many of us old-timers remember, Commissioner of Transportation under about 5 different governors, taught me that one of the lessons was the key to ridership is to have the fewest number of different modes of transportation. So if you have somebody has to drive a car to get to a station and then to take a train and then switch to another to light rail, you're just starting to depress your use of it. So, not having a station or two in St. Cloud that people could walk to or easily get to, get dropped off by the spouse or whatever, is really, really short-sighted.
Governor, there's some Republican lawmakers are going to propose a constitutional amendment at 2:30 today. They haven't officially said what it is, but there's talk that it might be on the gay marriage issue. How does that fit into the mix here? Again,
the constitutional amendment is something they can propose and pass if they decide to pass it. I'd have to again see the language. I don't know what it is.
Is that something you would campaign against?
I strongly oppose a constitutional amendment that would prohibit same-sex marriage. It already exists in existing state law, and I think to bind future generations from making their own reasoned decisions about what they think is appropriate is a big mistake.
Back on the budget, the words today from you have been some of the harshest we've heard probably. Are you losing optimism that you've expressed all along that you could actually reach an agreement at May 23rd?
Well, I think I've set some markers now. I mean, if they get the conference reports passed by a week from Friday, May 6th, and send them all to me, then we'll have 17 days left during which we can negotiate our differences. Then I would be optimistic we could reach an agreement by May 23rd. If they don't meet that timeline or aren't very close to it, then my optimism will definitely start to wane.
Sir, I was
Yeah.
late. I should take
Okay.
time change. How would you characterize your thoughts going into the last push of the session?
Well, hopeful that we can reach this agreement by May 23rd, but realistic now that the clock is ticking. We're down to 27 days, and that they've had 70 days since I submitted my budget to prepare their own, and they're still resisting doing so, and they're resisting every which way, meeting the same obligation I had to submit an honest, balanced budget, and until they do so, we can't begin the final negotiations. Yeah.
Is there anything you can do to reach out, to have them over for coffee?
We had breakfast this morning where coffee. Every week we agreed. First we're meeting every other week. Now we agreed about the last 3 weeks. Now we've met every week. I meet every Tuesday morning with the Republican legislative leadership, and every Wednesday morning with the DFL legislative leadership. I urge them again today, as I have for over a month, get these conference reports finished and send them to me, and then we'll start from there. All of us set a budget. They'll set a budget, and all I can do is urge them. I can't make them act, but I told them that's, to me, the only responsible thing for them to be doing right now.
Is there one last question?
Doug?
Will things, assuming that a gay marriage amendment, for example, comes up, will that sort of thing change the tenor and make fiscal issues all the more difficult? If you have a bunch of these controversial social type issues that pop up now in these last weeks of the session, what will that do with the tenor of the other negotiations?
Well, Chris, this one could carry over to next year. So I mean, again, I don't know whether. First, I heard that it's even coming up this session. I'd heard more it was more likely to come up along with other constitutional amendments next year. But I mean, their calendar is cluttered. But again, they can handle whatever they choose to handle. I mean, I've never seen the legislature literally run out of the ability to act on the things they wanted to act on. As I said, I've seen that hood on over the clock. So the things that don't get done are not done by intention, not by accident.
You mentioned former Governor Bush.
Yeah.
What was that meeting like? What did you learn?
It was a very cordial meeting, and I read some briefing materials ahead of time. I was very impressed with what he had done for education in Florida. You know, he had set a test that every third grader had to pass in order to proceed to fourth grade. No social promotions. They trained 2,000 teachers of teaching teachers how to teach reading, and put those in the early grades. And they started with they have all-day kindergarten. He was amazed that Minnesota did not have all-day kindergarten. They have he started a program of preschool for 4-year-olds based on Title I eligibility. So kids that are starting to struggle to have the same advantages that others have are given that support. And he brought the rate of failure down from 33% to 15% in terms of passing the third grade reading test. I was very, very impressed, and I took careful notes, and I'm going to take it forward from this point and probably look, especially the next legislative session, to emulate some of it. He also increased funding for K-12 education too. So no, it was a very cordial conversation. I was very impressed. Thank you very much.